Welcome, Matthias.
Hey, thank you, brother.
So, Matias Baker is the founder and operator of Kheper Dynamics. It's a consultant-based service focused on the art and science of biodynamics and holistic design. And he's worked on a wide range of biodynamic projects and has helped establish new communities throughout North, Central, and South America. Currently, he's building a research sanctuary named Matriosa with his partner Svava up in the beautiful California Sierras. And he's told me some about this amazing piece of property, and hopefully, we'll hear a little bit about it in his presentation today. But wanted to mention too, just he's working on some amazing thoughts around how we can reinvigorate festival life. So, thank you, Matthias, for joining us today. And maybe we could just get started with what's been your personal relationship to working on the land?
Yeah. Um, the practice of building a personal relationship to the land has been the heart of working with the land. And in the past, this work, for the most part, began for me through basically participating in the ritual life of a community and kind of experiencing the different um, cultures and how they paid attention to how they were paying attention to a given rhythmic cycle within the great cycle of the year. So, for example, in Mexico, there was a time when I was invited to a family's farm way out in the hills outside of San Miguel de Allende. And little did I know that this was a very special time for this family. And got there, I could sense there was this sort of mood within the space. And then following morning at sunrise, I was woken up to join the grandmothers in making these special herbal concoctions and teas. And after those teas were to the liking of the grandmothers, we then took those teas out in these little bowls out to the pasture and made these little whisks out of the plants and did this whole seasonal anointing ceremony on the actual cows. So we would take these little teas of these special plants that they have collected and through prayers, because they were saying prayers as we were doing it, would then drizzle those teas on the backside and on the head of the animal and on their horns and on their feet. And it was, yeah, pretty amazing. And then in the evening time during sunset, I was asked to join the grandpas to go out to their different little milpas to collect the first corn. And so we followed each grandpa and their little milpas and would get these little bundles of this rainbow colored corn. And then that was all brought back to the house where the sons had been preparing a fire. And the grandpa would then take their corn and in this very ornate way would lay that on the coals of the fire. And then there was certain songs that were sung and it was quite beautiful. And then when the grandfathers knew that the corn now was ready, because he placed it there in the husk, and this was fresh corn, that he would grab this hot corn like a hot potato and would throw it most often to the kids, and they would have to like sort of jumble it around, and then eventually, when it cooled down enough, everyone would sit there and would have this elote festival and eat the corn. And 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 in that, a lot of the people would share visions and experiences or memories or wishes for the oncoming year and what they'd like to see in their work with nature. So there's this beautiful circuit between the cow anointing in the morning, which provides things for the soil and the support of the corn that then supports then the health and nutrition and
Right.
communal life there in the village. of the people that who tend the cows. So it was this nice little beautiful little um, circle that I experienced there. Um, Another time that comes to mind is when I was up in the mountains, up in the Sierras of Colombia, which is where I was born. And I had the amazing opportunity to go and spend time with the Kogi Indians there. And um, one day, I was asked to join the mamos, which are the priests, to go up to the sacred coca plant gardens to collect their ceremonial leaves for a ritual that was kind of going to happen later on in that day, sort of towards the sunset of the day. And so once we gathered all the leaves, they were all placed in this communal basket, and we went down into the center of the village, and that basket was placed down. And there was also this fire that was made there where they placed these um, seashells that they had collected from the ocean there to kind of sort of cook them and kind of roast them.
Right.
And when that was done, they took all of those roasted seashells and put it in this big mortar and pestle, and then it was pounded into this fine
Right.
powder.
Right.
When that was completed, then the women came and gave all the people these beautiful hand woven bags made out of this cotton tree and also wool from their animals that they have hand spun. They're called mochilos. And everyone put this bag on, and one by one would go, and the mamas would take a handful of the coca leaves out of the basket and would put it in each one of the people's bags. And then everyone was given a little bit of the powdered um, seashells, which they put in this little gourd, which they called a popola. And then everyone then dispersed and kind of went out on their own to all these different sacred sites throughout their land, some overlooking the mountains, some by a river, some by a sacred tree, or some, in their gardens or by their animal paddocks. And they would sit there and would meditate for some time. And then they would take this little dowel, this little stick, and they would take that out, and they would take this big wad of the coca leaves out of their mochila bags and stick it up in their cheeks and kind of get it sort of like a chew there, and would take this dowel and would stick it in that chew with the saliva and kind of twist it around and then pull that out and then dip that into the gourd where the powdered egg, or I keep saying eggshells, the powdered seashells were. And then they would take that out and stick it back in and do a twist. And there's this little like gelatinous seashell calcium coca leaf goo on the stick. And then they would rub it on the outside of the gourd. And they keep repeating this process while they're in this meditation. And little by little, a little calcium deposit would start to form on the gourd, like a little layer. And you could tell the old elders, they had their gourds, there was this huge knot of a composite on there. And then the young folks, they just had this little layer on it. But they all were out there for hours doing this meditations in this sacred spot. And this was their instrument for their meditative practice. But one thing that was interesting is that when they were done in that location, they would go to another, and there was this whole series of different pathways that connected all these spots. And what I observed was when they were walking on this path, they often would cross someone else coming in this path, and they would stop and pause, and one would take out some leaves from their bag and put it in the other person's bag, and they would take some leaves out of their bag and put it in their bags, and then they'd go on to the next spot. So there was this wonderful meditative sort of tapestry that was woven all through this landscape. And then the mamos or the priests were kind of listening into that to receive insights for the community and for their work with nature. And that became a pretty sort of potent experience of how sort of to work on the land. and how to build a personal relationship through this ritual.
Wow.
The last one I would share that really impacted my work on the land greatly was a time when I was asked to be a carrier of a buffalo medicine skull by my dear Lakota brother. And this was done through a pretty intense ceremony, which was basically a series of different offerings to the earth mothers and to the fathers of the sky. And that was working with the tobacco pipe, that was working with how to place things on altar and the movements around the circle and the song and the dances. And yeah, it was a pretty heavy experience. And to this day, every time I hear those songs, I kind of lose it. And but then the skull was then medicine skull was sort of to be used as this kind of intentional moral anchor for doing ceremony on the land, like making preparations or remedies. So when I'm working here, I will take that out and would usually place that buffalo on the altar where I'm getting all of the different substances together and will do my work. And I'm still learning how to work with it. And there's a lot more that's, I think, starting to be asked to kind of really get a little more deeper into that work. But that experience was a big one for me in the past for building this personal relationship to the land.
Yeah, it's powerful. It's amazing that you've had the chance to connect with these traditional cultures through that. I think,
Yeah.
that's part of, at least as a contemporary person working with biodynamics, how does one connect to those traditions without it feeling like appropriation or misunderstanding the depth of them? Could you speak to how biodynamics integrates with that in your life?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily call it an integration. It is just a soul way that I carry in all my levels of work in biodynamics in sort of some way. Um, the sort of challenge is to still oneself to receive in a certain event or activity, which part of these practices to sort of bring in. What is that particular nature phenomena or work in the community is kind of calling for. So as a kind of a agricultural healer, you're kind of listening into the tenor of the soul mood of the space to sort of receive pictures out of that then can correspond or link to some of these practices from these different cultures. And then you can sort of bring it in a a kind of a new way, but also in a way that still honors these traditional practices.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you. You were going to speak today on the significance of transforming agriculture into an agriculture of spiritual deeds.
Yeah.
So tell us about that. Take the floor here.
Yeah, well, before that, I know you also, I think, was embedded in your question is just how sort of biodynamics also entered into my life. And I like to just share a little bit into that because it links to this sort of practice to approach this spiritual deed work. Because biodynamics entered into my life as a feeling. About 27 plus years ago, woo, I found myself in a small little fishing village in the southern part of Belize. I went down there, with just my backpack as a young guy in search for the meaning of life and also mangoes. And but in truth, I really sort of didn't know really what I was doing or what I was doing there. But one day I met someone who eventually over time trusted me to share a secret. And this secret was that she was friends with this fifth generation Mayan healer named Miss Beatrice Waite. And she kind of instructed me to go sort of seek her out, knowing that I was really in store for a pretty intense experience with Miss Beatrice. Um, so I left the coast and headed up actually to the northern part, up into the mountains to meet her. And a long story short, I sort of ended up spending several years with Miss Beatrice, and she really put me through some pretty intense healing initiations. Um, and she was one of those types of healers that wasn't afraid to sort of push you into the deep end of the mystery pool. And so after almost drowning a dozen of times, she saw that eventually that I could swim, and and kind of out of the blue said that it was time basically for me to leave, and instructed me to go back to this fishing village where sort of my journey in Belize began. And but now going back to this place, I was sort of carrying sort of new questions and was on this sort of healing mystery path now and was starting to find some meaning of why I was coming down there. And it wasn't too long after coming down there that I met sort of a very strange character named Mr. Bob. And Mr. Bob had been living there in this community for a number of years, and we became friends. And one day he took me to his house, which was actually this little sardine can sized little trailer that was engulfed with all these medicinal plants, surrounded by composts and fruit trees, and he had built topsoil on the sand there because we were right by the ocean, and all the life was kind of hanging out there. It was pretty wild. But we got into this little trailer, and there's only like really two places to kind of sit there, and he sat me down, and which was actually right in front of this sort of bookcase, and staring at me was How to Know Higher Worlds, occult science, and the agriculture course, things also like Secret Life of Soil and stuff. And he said, have a look and yeah, introduce yourself to the school of Rudolf Steiner. And so I spent a lot of time starting to just read and kind of go through that, asking questions, because he had gotten the impulse from farmers and people he worked with back up in Illinois when he was living there before coming down to Belize. And so then I'm, reading all this material, and when I got to the agriculture course, yeah, even though I didn't really understand it, I was just overcome with this wave of feeling that, not for one, that I was or had found my life's work, but two, the feeling was that I had really met my people and had met my community. And that feeling has sort of been a kind of a foundation stone for my work in seeking this path of transforming agriculture into a spiritual deed.
Ugh, beautiful. Yeah, those books, right?
Yeah, but it was also this feeling of wow, I don't understand any of this really, but something in this that language really spoke to me because he spoke in pictures, and my background was art, and something in that just it felt alive, which and the way that it was scripted kind of really also helped me to have this connection to sort of this community that stood behind this in some way. And then it became this journey of really then going to meet and discover the stories of that community. And it was, yeah, pretty amazing because then I went back to the United States and landed back in my home state, Delaware at the time. And where do you begin looking for this thread of of spiritual science and biodynamics and Rudolf Steiner's work in Delaware? And but I did end up finding the only gardener in biodynamic gardener in Delaware and got there and started to learn from her. And she had just come back from one of the um, annual conferences and had this long email list of all the contacts of all the people in the movement. And so then I basically called them all up and sort of built a little school out of that. And as they say, the rest was history. Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Through all that, still carried this feeling that I was sort of now meeting my folks. And that really was true when I started meeting these folks. There was just this very open, warm-heartedness to everybody that I had met. Yeah, which really impacted me and really gave me a sense that this is where I kind of belong. Yeah.
Yeah. So clearly that's had a deep impact on you. So tell us how that turns agriculture into an agriculture of spiritual deeds.
Yeah. Well, for that, I guess I can begin by turning to that passage I mentioned yesterday out of the talk Rudolf Steiner gave to the youth right after the agriculture course, which I think is called, Youth Search in Nature. Yeah, good little thing. So I'll just read it if you will allow here. So it goes a little something like this. We must learn to understand in our hearts what it is that transforms the merely intellectual conception of spirit, which remains estranged from nature, into the spirit that has been truly worked for, which finds its path again into the world of experiencing nature. Therefore, I have tried in this course to find my words, as it were, out of actual experience. Today, you will find the Spirit in no other way than by finding the possibility of clothing it in words given by nature. And through this, the sensations will grow strong again, transforming what apparently lives only in ideas into real devotion. Then you will be on the best path. You are on the best path of all if you transform things into devotion. Just think of what everything could become in the case. Meditating means to transform what one knows into devotion, to transform the single concrete things. And then he goes on to say, if you express such things, of course, as I have done many times, you lay yourself open to be called audacious. And so, yeah, a lot of very bold characters in that passage. But it was in that passage um, that there was a particular sentence that really sort of struck me or really sort of stood out to me. And I'll read that part one more time. Today, we can find the Spirit in no other way than by finding the possibility of clothing it in the words given by nature. Today, you can find the Spirit in no other way than by finding the possibility of clothing it in the words given by nature. So, hidden in these words, I feel Rudolf Steiner is pointing to sort of a layered spiritual deed. The first deed in that is of finding a possibility. So, what is the finding of a possibility, whether in nature or in oneself? There's many ways to address that, but one could say that it is simply tracking things in my garden in the context of time, rotation, and rhythm. Like the experience that Dennis shared yesterday of observing plants all turning yellow at the same time in his garden. And somehow that led to an understanding of how the the quality of light, the length of day, as subtle as it is a real big deal, is a real significant trigger in the household of nature. And that sort of created for him this sort of sensitiveness and awareness for what occurs at that time of the year in the plants. And that awareness then led to practices such as creating ferments to address the plant's need in that time, for instance. And that for me is an example of the second deed in that part of the sentence that he asked, was then to clothe it in the words given by nature. In other words, finding this insight provided by nature and creating something out of it, like a remedy or a ferment for a plant, which is then giving that insight into a new form back to the plant. As Dennis said, to find the way into nature is out of nature herself. Yeah. And so I feel that that really helped depict this part of the clothing. Um, how'd it go? Clothing it in the words given by nature. Now, there was this last little hidden deed level that I feel Rudolf Steiner was also asking us in this sentence, and that is, how do I see the words given by nature in the first place? How do I see them? And I, for me, this requires a practice of forming one, new organs of perception that can perceive and receive the words given by nature. Because nature, as we all know, is always given out these words. It's kind of this open word secret. But we have to form these new forces, these new organs in our soul, like imagination with a capital I, in order to have, as Dennis says, this feeling of evidence that this phenomena I'm experiencing is trying to tell me something. And can I hear these letters? And can I make a few words out of these letters? And then can I form these words given by nature into a script? And for this experience, to truly unfold, we must transform this feeling of evidence and the knowledge that one receives or one is revealed to into devotion. So I bring this way of looking at this passage from Rudolf Steiner to illuminate this mood of devotion in the soul. This devotional attitude and gratitude is what we need to really cultivate over time as agricultural healers, so that there will be a future where agriculture is an agriculture of spiritual deeds. Well, yeah, this passage still very much lives with me, because I think that he really breaks it into something very, very simple, about this devotional mood of soul. And there was kind of a living experience that I had of this, when working with Devin Strong, the Lakota um, um, biodynamic practitioner that I spoke to earlier, who gave me the buffalo medicine skull. And Devin was an amazing character, and he was sort of taking on this sort of task of taking what was given to him by the Lakota elders as these different ceremonial practices and marrying that traditional practice with the work in anthroposophy, namely his work in biodynamics. And it was out of the marriage of these practices that Devin found a new ritual for connecting to the consciousness of the buffalo herd that he had in his farm and to their group soul. But in fact, it was the words of the buffalo spirit that gave him the sequence for this new ritual that he shared with me and that I'd like to just share with you. And this ritual began first by the design of the sweat lodge. And the first part was to make the actual structure of the lodge itself by collecting different willow branches and binding them together with the sinew. And where they had connected, there was then placed a prayer tie. And then that structure was then built to then hold a whole bunch of layers of all the hides from the buffalo from the past sacrifices that Devin had. And he was told that this now, and it was like a little dome, represented the earth and the earth body. And then we went into the center and dug a hole out from within the lodge and then took that soil out and made this little mound out in front of the entrance of the lodge. And he was told that this was the image of the moon separating from the earth. And this is where we would put our reflective offerings like a buffalo medicine skull on and all our different little um, intentions and different forms of gratitude there. And that was then reflected back into the earth. Then there was this place outside of that, right in line with this earth moon, where we made a fire pit and the fire was made. And this was told to him was the sun. And outside of the sun was this great ring of different stones, which he was told represents the fixed stars of the zodiac. Then the fire tender of the sun would then take inspirations and of the stones from the zodiac and bring them into the actual fire to be warmed up. And then the person would take those stones when ready and walk through the gate of the sun and moon back into the center of the earth and place these stones. And then we would get in there and would do the sweat. And this happened each day for 4 days. And in each day, there was a whole series of making different prayer ties. Each one had its own sequence of prayers and songs that we were given. And then those prayer ties were then put out onto the reflective moon altar outside. And then after all that was completed and the ties were complete, then we would then went to sleep, and then early in the next morning at sunrise, we woke up to do this great tobacco pipe ceremony, which was another whole series of passing the pipe. Each time there was another type of plant that was put in the pipe that was actually shown to him by his buffalo, like osha root, for example. And each one of these plants was another octave of intention for what Devin called was preparing the heart and readying his heart for then what was to come. And that stage was then to go out to the buffalo herd to then take one of the animals down. But I'll back up that when we were making the prayer ties in the actual sweat lodge, this is also the time where Devin is then making contact to the group soul of his buffalo herd, sort of helping to prepare then that a great transition was about to come in the form of taking one of their members of the family. And often the buffalo would then send messages back as saying, we already know what's kind of coming, and here's a few pictures and things we need you to be carrying during your time for us. And there was all kinds of tasks and different messages in that for Devin. So then when we were out there, we often experienced the actual buffalo um, that was selected would separate itself from the herd completely and kind of offering itself to Devon. And one of the important steps in his practice that was also an agreement with the buffalo was that the animal was to be taken down by a great spear through the heart. And this was important because that allowed for the consciousness of the animal not to be traumatically separated from the animal, which would happen in some ways, like with a gun or things like that. So this was a big part of this whole ceremony, and usually it was this whole dance between Devon and the animal until the animal finally sort of did a great giveaway to open its side for Devon to place the spear in. And then the animal went down, and then Devon would grab his drum and the prayer ties that we had made in the sweat lodge and a great eagle feather fan, and would then drum and summon the rest of the herd who were kind of nearby already standing in to come down to say their goodbyes and to witness what was taking place in this ceremony. And often that was led by the big great male leader of the herd, and he would come in and would be sniffing and breathing heavily into his passing friend there, and would lick the blood off of the nose and off the wound, and then sort of said its thing, and then would walk off, and then the rest of the herd, starting with the matriarchs one by one, would say their goodbyes. And then there was a point where Devin had to come in with this great eagle feather fan to kind of sort of move them away, and in a gesture that now I'm taking the responsibility to usher this animal across the threshold for you and for the health of the herd. And that's when he would start coming to the animal and would basically just run that feather fan over the body, kind of helping in a way the spirit and the soul to transition. And then he would take the prayer ties that we made in the sweat lodge and wrap them around the actual horn of the animal. And then there was another sort of song that he would sing with his drum to sort of close that part of the ceremony. And yeah, it was, yeah, pretty powerful to say the least. And then we would then take then the body, and then we would do all of the harvesting of the organs for then all the biodynamic preparations that we would make in that day. And I can tell you that I've done prior to that a lot of animals in different communities for these preps, but when we were opening up that buffalo, there was this resonance or this spiritual atmosphere within these organs that I to this day will never forget. And in that there was this direct feeling that this ritual was really a teaching of how to transform ourselves and allow our deed to just flow into the earth just as the buffalo do in this great giveaway practice. And that really, yeah, became a real foundation experience for me for then working in my work with animals and with the organs and making of the preparations, but also just helping to reset a different stage of this devotional mood in my soul and helping to make our work into this spiritual deed. And so I went out with this as a part of my experience, and has been taking this in many ways into my work. And this really helped as a background to then sort of see when certain things in nature are sort of tapping you on the shoulder and trying to share its words with you. And because of these experiences, you have a certain receptivity in your will to kind of to to bring them in inwardly and to then work with them. And I don't think this experience I'll share now that happened in Costa Rica would have really happened if it wasn't for this work that I was doing with my dear brother, God rest his soul, Devin Strong. Because there was one time when I was in Costa Rica and we were, yes, working with the biodynamic harvest of the bovine, and we had to take our animal to the local abattoir to be processed. And and it was a pretty closed off scenario. And but I was told, well, I would give the guy the instructions of what we were needing, and then I was told to go out to the back of the abattoir where there was a little sort of door where there was the man who received the whole gut pile, and he would then take it, put it in a barrel for you that you could take back to the farm to work with the preparations. So I went back there and I was watching him work, and you could tell he had a deep personal relationship to the animal and to the organs, and had developed this very amazing artistic knife practice of how he was separating out these organs in the gut pile. And so when it came down to him, he would remove and separate the large and small intestines with the mesentery off from all of the main four chambers of the stomach. But then he did something that was quite remarkable. He had this way of cutting through this sort of maze of the stomachs that kind of opened and butterflied out the whole series of stomachs in one big sheath. And then he took that sheath and then sort of dropped out all the contents, which was a lot, into another separate barrel, and then grabbed the whole sheath and wrapped it around this big stainless steel cone right next to him and kind of draped it around. And then he flipped this switch and the whole thing started spinning. And then this big shower head kind of came down and started washing off the organs. And there was this little light that was coming through, sunlight coming through the door, and it was glistening on these organs as it was spinning, but he turned it inside out. So I was looking at all the inner surfaces of the different chambers of the stomach and how they metamorphosized into one another. And it was like a little movie, a little animation that was happening. And I got the immediate feeling that I was being asked to pay attention to something here. So I began to work with those four stomachs and that little movie that of the inner surfaces in specifically in how I took the inner pictures into my sleep, and then went back the following day to do my studies or to do my observation and work with these organs. And eventually, over time, by doing this, I challenged myself to try to teach what I had learned about the dynamics of the digestive or metabolic process of a bovine. And basically, when you teach something, you often are experience kind of your limitations of actually knowing what you're actually trying to teach, which usually comes in a form of a student who stands up and asks a question that's right in an area that you have a gap or don't have a real understanding of. And that happened for me, but that really was, for me, the angel of the whole process that was giving me this experience with the organs in the first place, to pay attention to something there in that question. And that question, when I started to expand on that, really led me into many very interesting deepening of my understanding of this. One in particular was finding this old article, this old research paper of a group of scientists, and this is kind of crude, but took an actual young bovine cow and put it in front of a large X-ray um, screen. And they made all these different pilules, or these little opaque pellets that kind of mimic the different weights and sizes of the foodstuffs that the animal was taking, and would give that into the cow. But then through the X-ray, they could see the movement of these and which way it went and how it worked through and the rhythm of that. And that gave me a real connect the dot experience of this great rhythmic patterning of how one chamber of the stomach connects to another, that connects to the other, that connects to the other, and what their relationships were. Because there really wasn't a lot out there on the marvel and the deep complexities of what was in this digestion. There was all just these more common, descriptions of things. So this really helped me to really further penetrate this, because now I had this rhythm to go along with the sequence of images, specifically the sequence of the inner surfaces of the stomach. And one thing that really sort of stood out in that was the function of the first stomach, which was the reticulum. And the reticulum, little did I know, was this great rhythmic organ for the whole digestive tract. And it was the rhythmic organ, one, because of its placement within the cavity of the organism, which it was really close to the diaphragm and to the heart and received things there, I believe. But also because it was the stomach that really was the go-between between two of the other chambers, and was a great sort of um, um, being that helped those two to sort of shake hands. And so the reticulum is connected to the esophagus, and when the food first comes down, and it receives that, and then is usually passes that over to the rumen, which is the great big fermenter. And then the rumen goes through its whole process of contractions and expansions and contortions to kind of work this big ferment, where all of the food stuff finds all its way into all these dorsal sacs, where there's all these different communities that of microorganisms that it's feeding. But then all of the sort of that the fluids and the finer parts, which also has solid parts, then are then sent back over to this reticulum. And this reticulum goes through this contraction and expansion, and then sort of separates the fine stuff with the solid parts, because the inner surfaces of that are like this beautiful hexagonal net, otherwise known more commonly as tripe. So there's this kind of honeycomb little capsules that are all in this great grid that holds all of the actual solid parts, and then that sort of is then contracted to then be sent back over to the next stomach, which then is then refining those solid parts even further. But also, to share this kind of rhythmic gesture of this organ, it also is the organ that holds the function of then contracting to form the mollusk out of those solid parts, that then is regurgitated for the rumination period, or the meditation period of the cow, which then comes back as this sort of spiritualized little yeast ferment that then is given back over to the great rumen. So this organ is paying attention to this whole cycle between what's coming in through this regurgitation and rumination to the rumen, and then to the next stomach, which is called the omasum, which is just called the great book, because it has all these layers and layers and layers of sheets that when that valve opens and the reticulum sends in this watery mass over into there, then that valve shuts, and then that sort of goes through this contraction, and in all the layers it kind of grinds up the 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 food even finer for more nutrient absorption, basically. But what also this organ of the reticulum is doing is also regulating the whole water drive within the cow, particularly by how it receives all of the saliva. And an adult female will produce 15 to even some species or even 20 gallons or more a day of just the saliva, which is mostly just water. Um, and but then there's all these different alkalins that are also in the saliva that then the rumen or reticulum receives, that then passes over this great water over to the rumen to be a great pH balancer, because the rumen is more acidic in nature. So the reticulum receives all of the water and regulates that by bringing that to the rumen, and then also bringing it in at a certain time after the next chamber. The omasum is done. It opens the valve up and all that water comes in to help wash out all the fine parts to go to the last true stomach, which is called the abomasum, because it has the glandular structures and the secretions and enzymes and the hydrochloric acids for breaking things down and for absorption, but setting things up for the intestine. So now all of that sort of pictures then help to kind of set something up in my organ of perception. And then one day I was in Oregon and I had gone out to explore things in nature and found this rock quarry, and was up in this rock quarry and kind of met the guy who was operating and asked him if I can go kind of can walk around in certain areas, and he sort of let me do that after some convincing, and I found this whole section of what was called columnar basalt. And I was looking at the face of it, and there was this amazing form and pattern of this hexagonal grid, and immediately this whole image of the reticulum kind of came in. And I saw that there was a correspondence there between this basalt and this reticulum organ. So then I went to start to do my investigations with columnar basalt, which there was many things that came in, but one in specific was just, which came out of an amazing work of Walter Kloos, where he spoke about the columnar basalt was a reflection of a great transition period in Earth's evolution, where the Earth was regulating the water element into a more solid state of matter. And so that really sort of pinged me, because this connection to a time which he and Steiner equated to when the moon was separating from the Earth is when this mineral was taking its form, and the form was these great pillars and this great hexagonal grid. And the columnar basalt had also that expression, because it was really working out also this dynamic, yes, of the water pole into the solid, but also was working out a great balancing or dynamic of this calcium sphere, and bringing it into a connection to a silica process. But also there's a lot of, within the basalts, a lot of silica percentage, particularly in that columnar basalt. And so all of this kind of really sort of was a sort of a placeholder, or was a next stepping stone to then connect to something then in the plant world. And for me, I had been working, of course, over time with the equisetum plant, because we were asked to make a tea for that to help balance out the lunar forces when too excessive or too waned. And so I was working with this plant, and in the springtime, when going out and observing it, you will see this first emerging shoot, which is kind of the female shoot. And then when you look at the head, which is called the strobulus, you will see that there's all these different spore heads, or sporangia. And you will see that there is also this sort of gesture of the basalt and also the reticulum. And that really sort of was profound to me. So I started to then investigate that, and I found these different analogs between the horsetail basalt and reticulum, working with this silica, calcium, iron, sulfur radiations. They all had a very similar function. And the horsetail, yeah, as we were told by the great Carl Koenig, has a deep crave and yearning for calcium, so much that it has to put a silica jacket on to dampen that greediness down. um, so this plant, yes, has this amazing ability, not just for the respiration and cycling of water through this great network of rhizomes that draw and absorb nutrients and transpire that through the plant, but it also has these deep signatures within the plant of this silica as well. And so I sort of started to work with then bringing that together with the columnar basalt, grinding that, and kind of doing a first little ferment in the gastric juices that I selected right out of the reticulum, and then blended that with some of the freshly ground spring growth of the Equisetum arvense, and placed that into this reticulum organ and buried it, in this case, for the winter months. And then I worked with it to help bring a balancing effect to conditions that were I was experiencing here in my little orchard, of different diseases that were kind of popping up because we were in a pretty intense drought. Things like fire blight and leaf curl and things. And when I had worked with this preparation, it really, yeah, helped to dampen down those disease, but at the same time creating this type of sort of moisturizing to the atmosphere below and above to the plant. And through the drought, they really stood up, even to the point where I didn't have to irrigate as much, even through the drought. And that just pointed to something more, to further research. And I'm still continuing to doing this work, but like many of this work, it kind of becomes these remedies become a placeholder for just leading you to another. And that's kind of where I'm at now, sort of deepening my understanding of this great dynamic between silica and calcium, which has brought me to once again to explore that work of our dear teacher Frederick Benesch, and he likened those two to the great mothers of the earth, along with the clay, who's the great meteor. So now I'm working on this, what I would call this mother offering remedy. And I hesitate bringing that because it's something deeply personal to me right now, but it also reflects my own personal sort of transformation and healing work that I'm doing with my karma. So that is just to share just this feeling of how this devotional mood that kind of was set through this ritual life of working with the buffalo led to an organ of perception to receive these words from nature to help her go beyond by, yeah, making a new remedy, a spiritual deed. That's what I have to share.
Uh, yeah. Thank you, Matthias. Yeah, that's what a journey. What a beautiful journey.
Yeah, thank you. And just to say that remedy is not trying to prove anything. To say this is a new preparation is just something that sort of came out of my biography to explore my personal relationship to nature. And yeah, maybe one day it will be something that can be shared more outwardly to help expand our research. But yeah, I just wanted to share that that was just, yeah, in many ways just a kind of a kind of a healing process that I was going through. Yeah, it helped my orchard and trees, but there was a whole healing thing behind all that. And then how this has led to this other work with the mothers, which is a yeah, a big part of the wound that I've been carrying because I was actually adopted and taken away from my mother as a baby. So this is I'm kind of oh, yeah, feel vulnerable in sharing that, but this is really I think what nature really asks us. And when we cure ourselves, we are in turn also curing nature. And yeah, clothing it, clothing the spirit of nature in the words that nature gives us. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for that tie into that quote because it does allow for the significance of why to do this study, this devotion to learning that language of nature. This Goethean picture that, the living picture imagination. I know that you learned deeply from Dennis.
Mhm.
But then the combination with these practices, I see where you come with this agriculture of spiritual deeds, because I think, as is said, returning nature back to the divine.
Yeah.
It, it's
Yeah.
honoring the majesty, the awe that is nature. And
Yeah.
that's really the deed. And I think with that reverence that's brought to the biodynamic practice,
Yeah.
I think as Anthony said yesterday, that's what brought him to biodynamics was the healing possibility. And
Yeah.
not just the land, but self too.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Huh.
Yeah. Towards the end of his life that he had these deep experiences, specifically with Ida Wegman and and exploring what were the next chapters for these healing mysteries. So he kind of made a turn, and that also include his work with karma relations, curative education, the work with the doctors, pastoral medicine, etc., and also biodynamics. So I really feel there's a real deep healing stream within what he gave during the agriculture course that one could say is really an initiation of the human heart or an initiation for the human heart to develop these capacities to bring what comes from the spiritual and put it into direct practical use. That's why I think Steiner really left with great joy because he could see that all this lofty spiritual esoteric practice in anthroposophy could now kind of come down into the practical, into the earth as a great deed.
Yeah.
And yeah, he yeah did a great spiritual deed by offering his relations and stories to us. Yeah, that 100 years ago.
Yeah. I've heard Waldorf education described that way as the teacher taking the journey through the grades is also this great initiation.
Yeah,
And I've loved that the biodynamics has that same gesture as well. And that's certainly I've heard now reflected many people saying that it's one thing to read the agricultural course, it's another to actually go through the process of doing all the preps,
yeah,
preparing them, you know, stirring great as a community event, but actually like holding the mesentery, or the bladder or like the
yeah,
horn, like building that relationship. And it's a challenge. We in fact have someone in the Q&A saying, I don't own a cow. How do I get access to these things? Maybe you can speak to that briefly. Just how does someone learn to gain access to doing the preps in a way that they can also have that soul journey?
yeah. Well, the doorway for me was really coming through this work with the buffalo and with the animal. And but that was, yeah, just one of the many doors. I think at large, this practice really is finding something in nature that sort of speaks to you, that is sort of calling to you, or that inspires you. For example, it's probably not random that every time you walk by a particular plant that you feel some kind of simpatico for or some kind of connection to. Well, it's because that plant's been for probably a long period of time trying to say, hey, I have something I need to tell you. But then how do I work with that plant? And this is what I really learned from as sort of one of the core out of Steiner's work that really was brought into a very contemporary form with Dennis by how we take that plant as a script of different living pictures or forms moving in time and taking them inwardly,
Yeah.
trying to refashion the image of the plant inwardly and trying to make that as exact as I can. And over time, that starts to build something in your feeling life. And you will have a feeling now that you can add to these pictures. And then quite often, when you go out to that plant again, it will show you something new. And then that keeps building to become a relationship. And then things start appearing and approaching like things, like invitations to go meet a farmer to work with an animal and you get exposed to the organs, or that plant tells you something about your organs, or that plant tells you something about a particular time that it's paying attention to within the great cycle of the year. And that usually begins a whole sort of sequence or a cascade within your experience that that you are then led. Steiner calls that intuition. And it's not so much the outcome of what that sort of is, let's say a preparation or a remedy or some great idea. It's more the stretching and expanding of your soul while in that process that matters most to nature. And so I just to answer the question, it's just beginning something like that with what inspires you in nature. And it doesn't have to be something out of the menu out of the agriculture course. It can be any plant because in my understanding, the preps were just pointing to new ways to do new research to find many different remedies that were specific to your community or to your needs and your ecological niche or of your time. Because I think we're in a time where we need these new remedies for all of these new conditions that we're facing now.
Right.
But doing those, but in a way that is also honoring the tradition. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. Learning from the experience and
yeah,
in multiple streams, not just the
sure.
biodynamic stream, as you've so beautifully told us today.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Because Steiner would probably change that name every year. It's not a noun, it's a verb.
Yeah.
That's always changing. But if it's not changing, then what Daniil was saying in his talk yesterday, things then become sort of static. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, one of the odd sort of notes I was given by a dear friend that had worked with someone to see what word Steiner used most often out of all of his lectures, and that was developing and evolving. And
Yeah.
so we have to involve this work.
Dynamic, like
Yeah,
Dennis said yesterday. Yeah.
have to evolve this work. Yeah, as a great honoring of where the work came from in the first place.
Right.
And
Yeah.
Steiner was saying that was the spiritual world.
Yeah. And the development of the inner tools to be able to evolve it. It's
Correct.
based on, like
Yeah.
you said, learning the language, learning to speak the words of
Yeah.
nature in order to speak back to it. That's
Hmm.
really important. And I think that's really what a lot of contemporary culture has lost is the ability to listen enough to learn that language. it's a pushing, it's a forcing rather than a reciprocity.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, it's been interesting. I've been reading a lot of Barbara Kingsolver. She has a new book out this year. It's on the
Okay.
serviceberry, and
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
so timely, and it really speaks to that, like, how do we incorporate the wisdom of these traditional cultures that have still this deep reverence because they haven't lost that awe. It's baked in.
Yes, it
And
is.
that is, the potential in biodynamics to hold that reverence, but we sometimes need to relearn to listen and not just,
Sure.
follow
Yeah.
the menu or things like that.
Yeah, exactly. And part of that relearning requires a kind of juvenilization in our consciousness. In other words, to kind of sort of become youthful or a kid
Yeah,
again, walking in nature.
yeah.
And
The not
that's
knowing.
not easy when you are yeah, up against a lot of these challenges. But yeah, there's something in this childlike imaginative consciousness that I think Grandma Earth really needs.
Yeah, very much so. Very
Yeah.
much so. Not
Yeah.
so not so fixed.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, wonderful. Well, thank you, Matthias.
Well, thank you. It's yeah, a real pleasure to be yeah, a part of this storytelling symposium.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you for being vulnerable with us.
Thank you.
Is there any place where people can learn more about you? I think we have your email address up on the
Um,
site. Do you have any things coming out we should be paying attention to?
yeah, a few things, but a lot of it sort of, yeah, kind of in the old school word of mouth. But one of the things we'll be doing, we'll be giving some, yeah, workshop slash courses at one of these farms I've been working with for over 12 years now, called Apricot Lane Farms. And so will there be some postings through their platform about yeah helping to expand this work with biodynamics. Yeah,
Excellent.
which is mostly around Southern California, but maybe in time we'll be doing some online things and stuff so that sort of a wider network can connect to them. But we're still just at a beginning phase there. Yeah,
Great.
with
Well,
they'll be doing something in March down there, um, and yeah, putting that together as we speak.
great. Well, if you send anything my way, I'll share it with our audience here. So
Hey, I appreciate it, bro, and thank
you
you
bet.
again, Ben, for all of the wonderful facilitating you do, man.
You bet. My pleasure.
The warm-heartedness in the space. I appreciate it.
You
Yeah.
bet. You bet.
All
That's
right.
important. Awesome. Wonderful. Thank you, Matthias.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, everyone. Wonderful to have such a warm heart, such a beautiful sharing.